If you have ever ridden a modern underground subway in a major city, you know the experience. It is loud. It is dirty. The screech of metal on metal is deafening. We accept this because we are told that moving millions of people underground requires massive, heavy industrial machinery. We think of our modern transit systems as the pinnacle of engineering. But what if I told you that over 150 years ago, long before the invention of the electric subway or the automobile, you could travel under the streets of New York City in absolute, perfect silence? In the year 1870, New York City had a functioning, completely silent underground subway powered entirely by air pressure. There was no coal. There was no smoke. There were no screeching metal wheels. It was clean, brilliant, and arguably centuries ahead of its time. It was called the Beach Pneumatic Transit System. It was, by every definition of the word, a 19th century Hyperloop. Today, modern tech billionaires are spending billions of dollars trying to reinvent vacuum tube travel, claiming it is the transport of the future. Yet our ancestors supposedly had it perfected in 1870. So why did they bury it? Why did they abandon a perfectly clean, silent, atmospheric transportation system and replace it with loud, toxic, coal-burning trains? Today, we are going deep underground. We are going to investigate the impossible construction of the world's first pneumatic subway. We are going to look at the massive, airtight brass and iron networks hidden beneath the streets of Paris and London. And we are going to explore a terrifying alternative history. The theory that the people of the 19th century did not build this incredible atmospheric transit system. They found it. To understand the anomaly, we must look at the official narrative. The story of the Beach Pneumatic Transit System reads like a Victorian spy novel. The year is 1870. The streets of New York are absolute chaos. Traffic is a nightmare of horse-drawn carriages, mud, and pollution. An inventor and publisher named Alfred Ely Beach decides to solve this problem by taking transit underground. But according to the official history, he cannot get permission from the corrupt city politicians to build a subway. So he decides to build it in secret. We are told that Beach and a small crew of men spent exactly 58 nights digging a massive, 8-foot-wide tunnel directly under Broadway. They supposedly smuggled the dirt out in the dead of night using wagons with muffled wheels, so no one on the surface would hear them. When he finally unveiled his creation to the public, New York was stunned. Beach had constructed a magnificent subterranean waiting room, complete with chandeliers, a grand piano, and a functioning fountain. But the marvel was the train itself, a beautiful cylindrical car that perfectly fit the tunnel. It had no engine. Instead, a massive steam-powered rotary fan located at the station blew a hurricane of air into the tunnel, gently and silently pushing the car down the track. When the train reached the end of the line, the operator simply reversed the fan, creating a vacuum that sucked the car seamlessly back to the station. It was an absolute sensation. During its first year of operation, nearly 400,000 people paid 25 cents just to ride it. It was completely safe, luxuriously comfortable, and entirely free of the suffocating coal smoke that would plague the elevated trains for decades. The public loved it. The press loved it. It was the undeniable solution to the city's transit problems. And yet, just a few short years later, the station was boarded up. The magnificent tunnel was abandoned, and the miracle of atmospheric travel was left to rot in the dark. If you read the official history of the Beach Pneumatic Subway, it is framed as a tragic tale of political corruption killing a brilliant idea. But if you look at the story through the lens of engineering, the entire narrative begins to fracture. Let us think about the logistics of what Alfred Ely Beach supposedly accomplished. We are told he dug a perfectly cylindrical, perfectly level tunnel, 8 feet in diameter, stretching for hundreds of feet beneath Broadway, one of the heaviest and most densely packed streets in the world. And we are told he did this in less than 2 months, in total secrecy, using a handful of men equipped with shovels and pickaxes. In order for a pneumatic transit system to work, the tunnel must be completely airtight. If there are variations in the curvature of the brickwork, if the tunnel sags or shifts even a fraction of an inch, the air pressure escapes around the train car, and the entire system fails. The train simply will not move. Modern engineers struggle to achieve this kind of subterranean precision today. Even with laser-guided boring machines, structural concrete, and billions of dollars in funding. Yet we are expected to believe that a group of laborers in 1870 achieved a perfect, airtight pneumatic seal through solid rock and mud, working entirely in the dark. How did they prevent the massive, heavy buildings above from collapsing into their secret excavation? Where are the original, detailed structural blueprints showing the load-bearing calculations? Just like the grand architecture of the era, the technical documentation is suspiciously absent. When the tunnel was accidentally broken into decades later during the construction of the modern subway, workers found the brickwork in pristine condition. It was a masterpiece of masonry. It did not look like an experimental tube hastily dug in the dead of night. Well, this leads us to a very disturbing alternative theory. A massive community of alternative history researchers argue that the highly advanced, airtight subterranean networks of New York and other cities were not built by men with pickaxes. What if Alfred Ely Beach didn't invent the pneumatic subway? What if he merely found an existing ancient subterranean corridor? What if he simply cleared the mud out of it, laid down some tracks, installed a fan, and claimed the genius of a previous, more advanced civilization as his own? If New York was the only city with an impossible pneumatic anomaly, we might be able to dismiss it as a strange historical fluke. But it was not alone. In fact, it was just a tiny fragment of a much larger global atmospheric grid. In the late 19th century, cities like London, Paris, and Berlin boasted sprawling, incredibly complex networks of underground pneumatic tubes. The official history tells us these were built exclusively for the postal service and telegraph companies. The Paris Pneumatic Post Network, for example, eventually comprised hundreds of miles of airtight brass and iron tubing stretching beneath the city. You could place a message in a cylindrical canister, drop it into the tube, and it would be shot across the city at incredible speeds using nothing but air pressure. We accept this as a quirky, steampunk relic of the past, but once again, the engineering required to build and maintain hundreds of miles of perfectly sealed, airtight metal tubing beneath a sprawling ancient city is mind-boggling. How did they lay hundreds of miles of seamless piping without disrupting the massive stone foundations of the European capitals? How did they maintain a perfect vacuum across such vast distances with 19th century seals and valves? And more importantly, look at the scale of some of these early systems. In London, the Pneumatic Dispatch Company built tubes that were large enough to fit an entire train car. In fact, their earliest demonstration cars were large enough to transport human beings, and people routinely took joy rides through the mail tubes. These tubes were not just tiny pipes for letters. They were massive industrial-scale transportation arteries. The theory proposes that these vast pneumatic networks were not built from scratch by Victorian postal workers. Yet they were the salvaged remnants of an old-world transit system, a global civilization, often referred to as Tartaria, that utilized atmospheric pressure and clean energy to move goods and people effortlessly beneath the earth. When the inheritors of these cities dug out the mud and discovered these networks, they didn't know how to operate them at their full original capacity. So they downgraded them. They repurposed the massive passenger tunnels for mail delivery, and eventually they sealed them up entirely. Here is where the story gets even stranger. Because we are not just talking about circumstantial evidence. We are talking about what engineers at the time actually said, in print, on the record, when they thought no one was paying close enough attention. Yes, in the proceedings of the American Society of Civil Engineers from the 1880s and 90s, there are remarkable passages in which the engineers tasked with expanding existing tunnel networks describe what they found when they broke through older sections of subterranean passage. The language is almost always the same. They describe the existing construction as exhibiting a regularity that surpasses current methods. They note that the curvature of older tunnel sections is so mathematically precise that their own boring equipment cannot replicate it. And more than once, they attribute this precision to the superior tools of a prior generation without specifying what those tools actually were. Think about what that means. Professional engineers, writing in sober technical journals, are openly acknowledging that the people who supposedly built these tunnels before them achieved a higher standard of precision than they themselves could match. And these are the men who built the Brooklyn Bridge. These are not amateurs. So where did the prior precision come from? The official answer, to the extent one is ever offered, is that earlier Victorian craftsmen were simply more skilled, more dedicated. They cared more about their work. But that is not an engineering answer. That is a mythology answer. Engineers do not get better results because they care more. They get better results because they have better tools. And the tools required to bore a perfectly circular, perfectly level, 8-foot diameter tunnel beneath a living, breathing city simply did not exist in 1870. At least, it's not according to any tool manufacturer's catalog from that era. But the physical evidence of those results is sitting right there, underground, perfectly preserved. The circle is perfect. The bricks are perfect. The mortar joints are perfectly even. It is as if the tunnel was pressed, not dug. Let us talk specifically about the machines. Because if you really want to understand how anomalous the Beach Pneumatic Tunnel is, you have to understand what tunneling technology actually looked like in 1870. You have to understand what the state of the art was. The most advanced tunneling technology available in 1870 was something called the Greathead Shield. It was invented by James Greathead in London, and it was, by every measure, a revolutionary piece of equipment. So it consisted of a cast iron cylinder pushed forward through the earth by screw jacks, allowing workers inside to excavate material in relative safety, while the shield held the surrounding soil from collapsing. The Greathead Shield was a genuine marvel of its age, and it was also enormous, expensive, extremely loud, and required a massive team of trained engineers, surveyors, and laborers to operate correctly. It was the kind of project that required years of planning, massive public investment, and explicit governmental authorization. You cannot hide a Greathead Shield under Broadway for 58 nights. Alfred Ely Beach did not have a Greathead Shield. According to the official record, he used a hydraulic shield of his own invention, which he had patented. But here is where the record becomes conspicuously thin. There are almost no surviving photographs of this device. There are no surviving detailed engineering drawings of it being used in situ. There are patent documents. There are newspaper descriptions. But the primary physical evidence of how this machine operated is essentially non-existent. We have the tunnel, we have the station, we have the train car, but the machine that supposedly made all of it possible has been almost entirely erased from the historical record. Compare that to virtually every other major engineering project of the era. The builders of the Brooklyn Bridge left behind mountains of documentation. The engineers of the Thames Tunnel filled entire volumes with their observations, their failures, their measurements. They documented everything because they knew they were making history, and they wanted future engineers to learn from their work. Alfred Ely Beach, a man who was also the publisher of Scientific American magazine, a man professionally and personally devoted to the documentation of scientific progress, left behind almost nothing that would allow a modern engineer to understand precisely how the tunnel was actually built. For a man who spent his career explaining inventions to the public, his own most famous invention remains, at the technical level, almost entirely unexplained. Now, here is the part of the story they really do not want you to focus on. Because the Beach Pneumatic Subway was not the only pneumatic system operating in New York in that era. It was the most famous. But it was not alone. At roughly the same time that Beach was demonstrating his passenger subway, the pneumatic systems were being installed throughout the city's institutions. The post office had its own pneumatic tube network connecting sorting facilities. Major hotels installed pneumatic tube systems to move messages and parcels between floors. Hospitals used them to transfer samples and documents across large campuses. These systems appeared very quickly. Far too quickly. Major institutions were adopting pneumatic tube infrastructure at a pace that suggests the technology was not new and experimental. It suggests it was already understood, already proven, already almost expected. Think about the adoption curve of any genuinely new technology. Think about how slowly businesses adopted the telephone. Think about how many decades it took for electricity to penetrate every layer of society. A new technology is always met with skepticism, expense, and institutional resistance. But pneumatic tubes were adopted with almost no resistance at all. Hospitals that would spend years debating whether to install a telephone switchboard were installing pneumatic tube networks in months. The reason that officially gets cited is that the technology was cheap and reliable. And I want you to sit with that for a moment. The technology that required a perfectly airtight seal across hundreds of feet of buried metal tubing, that required precision-machined brass canisters that would not snag or jam in transit, that required constant air pressure maintained by expensive mechanical compressors. This technology was considered cheap and reliable in the 1870s. The telegraph required a wire, a battery, and a key. It was genuinely simple. The telephone required a wire and a transducer, also genuinely simple. But a pneumatic network requires a sealed tunnel, a compressor, a perfectly calibrated air column, and a receiver mechanism at the other end that can catch a canister arriving at significant speed without destroying its contents. And yet the institutions of 1870 adopted pneumatic tubes faster than they adopted the telegraph. Why? Why is the more complex system adopted more rapidly than the simple one? There is only one logical answer that makes engineering sense. The pneumatic network was not new to them. It was already there, in the walls, in the subfloors, waiting. If you want the single most undeniable piece of evidence that an advanced subterranean network was already in place beneath American cities before the official histories claim it was built, you need to look at what happened in Chicago. In the 1880s, the Illinois Telephone and Telegraph Company began construction of what was publicly described as an underground conduit system for telephone and telegraph wires beneath downtown Chicago. The project attracted very little attention, which was likely by design. It was presented as boring infrastructure. Wires in tubes, nothing to see here. But what they actually built, what was eventually revealed, was something entirely different. It was a fully operational underground freight railway. Miles and miles of interconnected brick tunnels, 40 feet below street level. With electrically powered locomotives hauling goods, coal, and eventually mail beneath the Loop District. The Chicago Tunnel Company, as it came to be known, eventually operated 60 miles of tunnel and hundreds of small electric locomotives. It connected department stores, office buildings, and rail freight terminals. It moved millions of tons of material beneath the city streets without disrupting a single vehicle above. The official story is that this network was built quietly in secret, over many years, using construction crews working in small sections to avoid attracting attention. And that story has one enormous problem. The diameter of the Chicago freight tunnels is perfectly standardized throughout the entire network. Every single section, from every era of alleged construction, shares the same precise dimensions, the same arch geometry, the same brick coursing pattern. There is no variation that would indicate piecemeal construction by different crews over different periods. When you build something incrementally in sections over years, the seams show, the materials shift, the dimensions drift. Because human beings are not machines, and each new crew brings its own interpretation of the plans. This is so universal in construction that structural engineers use dimensional drift as a forensic tool to date sections of old buildings. The Chicago tunnels show no such drift. None. The network is geometrically consistent from one end to the other, across 60 miles of underground passage, allegedly built over decades by rotating crews of workers who had no modern measurement technology. Unless, of course, they were not building at all. Yeah, unless they were simply clearing, mapping, and adapting what they found already in the earth beneath their feet. If you inherit a completely silent, clean, hyper-efficient transportation system that runs on atmospheric pressure, why on earth would you abandon it? Why would you force your citizens to endure the noise, the filth, and the danger of conventional locomotives? To understand the destruction of the Hyperloop, you have to look at the financial architecture of the late 19th century. We have discussed this transition before. This was the era when the world was being aggressively pushed onto a new, metered energy grid. The financial titans of the age, the barons of coal, the emerging oil monopolies, and the steel magnates, were building an empire of dependency. They needed society to rely on heavy, consumable fuels. A pneumatic transit system is clean. It requires minimal moving parts. It does not require thousands of tons of coal to be mined, transported, and burned every single day. In short, a society that moves via air pressure cannot be easily monopolized by fossil fuel barons. The Beach Pneumatic Transit system in New York was a massive threat. It proved to the public that underground travel could be luxurious, silent, and clean. If that system had been allowed to expand, it would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern transportation. So, it had to be killed. The official history claims that Alfred Ely Beach lost his political backing, and that a stock market crash dried up his funding. But the result was the exact same. The clean, brilliant atmospheric subway was deliberately abandoned. Decades later, but when the city finally built its massive subway network, they did not use pneumatics. They used heavy, screeching steel wheels, massive electrical currents, and systems that required endless, expensive maintenance. They chose the dirty, dangerous, and highly profitable route over the clean, silent, atmospheric alternative. They didn't just abandon a technology. They actively buried the evidence of what was possible. They filled in the pneumatic tunnels. They shut down the postal tube networks in Europe. They erased the concept of atmospheric travel from the public imagination, relegating it to science fiction. There is one final piece of evidence I want to lay in front of you, because I think it is the most quietly damning of all, and it has to do with patents. In the 2 decades following the debut of the Beach Pneumatic Subway, there was an extraordinary explosion of patents related to pneumatic transit technology. Dozens of inventors filed detailed, sophisticated patents for improvements to pneumatic tube travel. Better seals, better pressure governors, better car designs, better switching mechanisms to allow tubes to branch and merge. The engineering thinking in these patents is remarkable. These are not the tentative exploratory filings of inventors who are still trying to prove a concept. These are the sophisticated refinements of engineers who clearly understand the underlying technology in depth. They are optimizing. They are improving margins. They are solving specific, narrow problems that only reveal themselves once a system is already mature and operating at scale. But here is the thing. Almost none of these patents were ever commercially developed. They were filed. They were approved. They were entered into the public record. And then, they were quietly dropped. The patents expired. The companies behind them dissolved. The inventors moved on to other work. In the world of technology investment, this pattern has a name. It is called patent suppression. It is the practice of acquiring or filing patents on threatening technologies not to develop them, but to prevent anyone else from developing them. We have documented evidence of this practice being used in the 1900s to suppress certain configurations of electric motor technology. We have evidence of it being used against early solar panel patents. And the pattern in atmospheric transit is, when you line the patent records up chronologically, almost textbook identical. The filings surge. The technology matures in the patent record. And then, right at the moment when the patents would begin to enable a new generation of engineers to build on the prior work, the filing stops. Completely. As if someone turned off a tap. Today, the greatest technological minds of our generation are standing on stages, presenting computer-generated renderings of vacuum tubes and atmospheric transit pods. They tell us that if we invest billions of dollars, we might one day be able to travel in silent, frictionless tubes. They sell it to us as the ultimate vision of the future. But history tells a different story. It tells us that over a century and a half ago, a civilization already knew how to build this. They already had the perfectly carved subterranean chambers. They already understood the physics of atmospheric pressure. Yet they already had the engineering knowledge, the material science, and the institutional infrastructure to deploy it at urban scale. And someone made a very deliberate choice to abandon all of it, to board it up, to fill it in, to bury the plans and discredit the patents and let the public forget that it ever existed, and then, a generation later, to sell that same public a louder, dirtier, and infinitely more profitable alternative. We are not inventing the future. We are desperately trying to remember a past that was stolen from us. We are trying to rebuild a fraction of the infrastructure that our ancestors supposedly dug out with pickaxes and shovels. We are paying billions of dollars to venture capitalists to reverse engineer a technology that was operating beneath our feet 150 years ago. Yet the tunnel is still there, below the streets of New York City, sealed off and forgotten. The brickwork is still perfect. The geometry is still flawless. The circle is still round. The next time you stand on a subway platform, listening to the deafening screech of the brakes and smelling the metallic dust in the air, remember the silent commute of 1870. Remember the destroyed Hyperloop. Remember the patents that went nowhere, the blueprints that disappeared, and the engineers who quietly noted in their journals that the tunnels they were inheriting were more perfect than anything they themselves could build. And ask yourself the question they never asked out loud. Who built them first? Thanks for watching. If you want to know what other massive, mathematically perfect energy grids they capped and buried beneath our feet, like the worldwide cobblestone anomaly, click the video on your screen right now.